Fun. So, this particular lecture is an extension of what we were talking about when it came to requirements. And we talked a lot about requirements yesterday. We talked about what they are, why they're important, and what we're going to be talking about today are essentially some useful ways to express requirements, because the examples that we looked at in the Introduction to Requirements lecture, yeah, like they were okay, but the thing about them was that a lot of them were really, like the examples I gave with the whole road legal car, they were very technical, like nearly legalistic, and a lot of what you actually do with requirements is far less legalistic than the examples that we kind of demonstrated yesterday. So requirements can be very human, and they can express complex flows as well. And we need ways to be able to model this effectively that isn't just a whole bunch of legalistic text, you know? So what we're going to be talking about tonight are user stories, user acceptance tests, use cases, use case representations, and these are all really just part of the same thing. So firstly, user stories. You might have heard of this before. If you haven't heard of it, you will probably hear of it in the future. It's a very common thing that floats around big tech. And user stories are basically just a way of writing requirements. They're just a way of expressing requirements. And they're used to describe requirements in a way that puts the user at the center of the requirement. So it really is about kind of user-first thinking. So again, very unlegalistic and very kind of more user-centric. Now, the structure of a user story, you know, if we kind of talked yesterday about that whole building a table thing. If you want to build a table, you might specify, you know, the table must be of this length. And again, if you remember the road legal car thing, you remember that it was quite specific, but user stories have a much more, again, a friendly and a human structure. And that structure is to say, for instance, as a type of user, for instance, as a UNSW student, I want a thing to, you know, to have a monorail on campus so that a reason, and that reason might be to get to the top of campus without walking, you know? So the example here, for instance, as well, is that if a student says, hey, I'd really like to be able to purchase monthly parking passes online to park on campus, that might be an example of a raw requirement that you hear about or receive as part of elicitation, you know, as part of that raw learning, but you might repackage that or you might rewrite that as a user story in terms of, as a student, person, type user, I want to purchase a parking pass, that's their goal, so that I can drive to school, which is the reason for the goal. And all of these components are very, very important. And in fact, you know, the reason here is extremely important, I think, because one of the things that the reason part helps you do is it helps you understand if the goal is too overfitted. And this ties into what we talked about yesterday when it came to the whole XY problem thing. Sometimes students might, or not students, sometimes people that you're trying to elicit requirements from might not have the right idea. Maybe they'll have a good problem, like they want to get to the top of campus quickly, but they'll have a terrible solution, you know. And this is really useful because if you as a developer or a product manager are able to kind of see that, you know, a user wants a monorail to get to the top of campus quickly, it might help you actually take a step back and say, let's review that requirement, and let's say perhaps this student could have their problem be solved simply by putting an escalator on campus or putting you in a cannon and shooting you up the top of campus or something like that. So lots of opportunity there. Now, the way that user stories are written is, again, they're not meant to be legalistic. They're not meant to be technical either. They're meant to be very friendly, colloquial, accessible, and again, user goal focused, not product feature focused. This is a very hard line to draw. This kind of literally comes back again to the XY problem, where you focus again on optimizing solutions by accident instead of the problems you're trying to solve. But these two lines are really hard to figure out. Like, it's not that binary. It's not like, oh, this is goal focused, this is feature focused, because sometimes goals are features, you know. For instance, if you're on Facebook or Instagram, I think I saw Instagram recently launched the ability to pay for things through Instagram. It's like, if you're an Instagram customer and you're like, I'd like to be able to pay my friend through Instagram, you can get all, why do you want to do that? What problem are you solving as much as you want? But sometimes you just hit a point where what sounds like a solution is actually the problem as well. And to the example that was mentioned in the last lecture, where I said that, I told students that story once about me asking for a fork when I really just needed an eating utensil. And, I had this good memory of the students in the course at the time. They said to me, I was like, yeah, I was actually looking for an eating utensil. And, they kind of jokingly were like, yeah, but why do you need an eating utensil? And I was like, well, I'd like to eat my food. And they were like, why do you need food? And I was like, well, to feel sustained and not hungry. And they're like, why do you, and it kind of gets to this hilarious point of like, you can always technically keep going deeper. You can always technically keep saying, yeah, that's a solution to the problem, but what's the underlying problem? That's a good thing to ask, but the point is that it's not just as simple as there's a solution and there's a problem. Often everything is just a big spectrum of, other things. For instance, here, if you go back to the previous example, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school. That's a fair point to say, purchasing a parking pass is a solution. It's a feature, but what is the actual user goal? The user goal is that I want to be able to, avoid, I want to be able to pay up front for my parking, or I want to be able to like subscribe to my parking, or avoid having to pay daily or something like that, and a parking pass might be a solution to that particular problem. But again, you could then take that a step up if you really tried and be like, well, the solution to... This is the tricky part, right? So it's like, okay, well, parking on campus is a solution to a problem, which is that you want to get to campus in private transport. And it's like, okay, well, why don't you catch an Uber? And you get into all kind of murky situations with it. So, for instance, if we were to, and we'll do this together, let's imagine that I've said to you all that we're going to build a to-do list. Task list, something where you keep notes. I want you to, in the YouTube chat, we've only got 23 people here, so we'll see how this goes, but I want you to just tell me, what are some examples of some user stories that you would write out? Or like, tell me what do you want from a to-do list app? If you don't feel comfortable trying to describe what you're doing as a user story, at least tell me what you want, and we can try and do it together. Like, what do you want out of a to-do list app? Just got to wait for good old YouTube. Reminders on certain items. Yeah, okay. So Cole says reminders on certain items. Let's see what else other people say. Color coding. Okay. Yeah, so like take this as an example, like what I'm doing right now, you could argue as a form of requirement solicitation. I'm kind of in a way doing a very crude, horrible version of customer interviews here. Hello Clayton says I want free money. That might be slightly out of scope of the problem, but let's have a look at what Alex and Ethan and Cole have said. So let's say here Cole's got reminders on a certain item. So for instance, as a student, that's a uni student, for instance, I want reminders on a certain item. Now, normally I would just ask Cole the follow-up, but it's like, in this case, I'm just going to assume that, and I shouldn't assume anything, but in this case, it might be like, I want reminders on a certain item so that I don't forget to do things. As a uni student, I want color coding on my tasks, so that I can more easily visually separate them. And then as a uni student, I don't know what timed reminders is. I don't know what that means. Normally you just kind of ask that. Jeremy says I want the ability to have a dark mode, or Ethan says importance hierarchy. And yeah, these are all good points. And again, the point I'm getting at here is this is how you could kind of structure some of these ideas into a user story-esque structure. So you can follow something like that if you'd like to try and get user stories like that. There are good properties of user stories generally. They follow this kind of, is it anagram? I can't remember what it's called, where each letter has a meaning. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable. I don't know what word. English, not good. Small and testable. So independent makes sense. If you have user, and this is actually, these are actually really important for, I guess, requirements in general, not just user stories, but they kind of come in the context of user stories. If you have many user stories, right, like here we have 2, you want to make sure that these user stories are independent as much as possible. As in, you should be able to go and execute or implement or make one of these come to life without having to do the other one. So they should not be too intrinsically connected. They should be negotiable, which means that they should not have too much detail. And this kind of, again, comes back to XY problem, where if you have too much detail or you are too specific on the solution, you remove the ability for the people like designers, developers, or people actually trying to figure out what they want to implement to have room to move, right? So if you get smart people, the best thing you can do is give them a really broad mandate and they go and take ownership of that. And if you're too narrow, you kind of stifle their ability to creatively solve problems. Then there's valuable. They need to hold some kind of value to the client. Okay, that makes sense. They need to be not useless. Estimatable, they need to, well, we actually don't look at this in a later lecture anymore because we got rid of it because it was kind of boring. But essentially, your user stories you should be able to easily estimate how much time it's going to take, or it should have a clear sense of scope. This is kind of the opposite of negotiable in the sense that they shouldn't be too broad. Because if they're too broad, it's very hard to figure out whether you've succeeded, how big it is, and everything like this. Small, they should be relatively small. In theory, requirements are good when they're small. I do kind of remember, this isn't to do with user stories, but I remember when I was doing some systems engineering education, someone pointed out to me that, you shouldn't really say that a car should be 5 meters long and 2 meters wide. They should be 2 separate points. A car should be 5 meters long. A car should be 2 meters wide, because you always want, where you can, to break requirements up into smaller and smaller pieces, as it allows people to essentially get them done in smaller and smaller pieces. And obviously things should be testable as much as humanly possible. You can go and read more about this if you'd like, but that's essentially the quick summary. This used to be a really big part of the course before I took it over, but I made it a bit smaller because I think that user stories are essentially ways to demonstrate requirements. They are really a way to articulate yourself in relation to requirements engineering that has come up dramatically more commonly as part of the big tech movement, where we see more and more products put out there for customers, where that's a lot of what companies do now. User acceptance criteria is a part of is often tied to user stories. And it's really a process whereby if you have user stories, for instance, the ones we wrote down about the to-do list app like this, this is a method to help us test whether a user story has been satisfied. So what that means is that if you have a user story, what you actually do is you break it down into a set of criteria for the user or customer to accept, and then you give it to them nearly like a checklist to get them to do it. So for example, if you have a user story like this, as a user, I want to use a search field to type a city, name, or street so that I can find matching hotel options. So think about, hotels.com or bookings.com or something like that. And you might write out some user acceptance criteria that says something like, these are like checkboxes. The search field is placed at the top. Search starts once the user clicks search. The field contains a placeholder with the gray colored text. Where are you going? All of this kind of stuff. And this is essentially you writing out your own tests, because you might think, well, this isn't test, this is English. But when you're dealing with requirements, what's really happening is that you aren't operating at this really low level like you have been in 1531. You're operating typically where the tests are real humans using a real product. So therefore, they're not going to be thinking in terms of jest or integration tests or anything. They're just going to be able to use it. Now, if you look at these acceptance criteria, these ones are actually extremely specific. And again, there is no universal method for how specific these should be. I would call these on the much more specific side. For instance, one user acceptance criteria could be much simpler and say, when a user types in Sydney, they can see at least 10. They can see at least a dozen hotels in Sydney, or they can see what appears to be all of the hotels in Sydney. It could be something as simple as that, or it could be something as detailed as this. Obviously, the more detailed it is, the more rigorous you can test it, but the more detailed it is too, the more you stifle the ability to develop, because typically you'll write out these kinds of acceptance criterias prior to actually doing the coding, and therefore if they're too specific, you're kind of like inadvertently controlling what designers and programmers should do to bring something to life at the requirements level, which isn't good. But the main philosophy here to take away is that when you write requirements, or for example user stories, it's important that you actually have and set out a criteria that defines whether or not that particular story was successful. That's really important. Here might be a slightly better example, I think, which is that if a user story is, as a user, I can log in through a social media account because I always forget my passwords. It's like, it's kind of annoying, right, when you log into Netflix and you have to log in with a username password. Now, obviously, the reason Netflix and stuff do this is because people share passwords, and it'd be kind of weird to sign in with Google and stuff. But let's imagine that that was suddenly an important thing to the company. Imagine suddenly they got a whole bunch of demand for people who want to use social media login, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Apple, etc. They could write a user story like this, and this would be the acceptance criteria: that they can log in through Facebook, that they can log in through LinkedIn, they can log in through Twitter. Did I say Twitter? It's really specific. Acceptance criteria should not be too broad. They shouldn't be too narrow. Just like I said, there's a certain level of balance here. They should minimize technical detail. They should more be about how a user uses something. It should feel like they weren't necessarily written by an engineer per se, but written by someone who understands what you're building very well, which of course could be an engineer. Ideally, they should be written before you actually start implementing stuff, and a lot of the time, acceptance criteria you write aren't actually mapped to automated tests. Like I said that before, a lot of acceptance criteria for user stories are very high level. They're really, so at the start you define your requirements, and then you define some high level tests. And then, from these 2 points, someone comes along and, designs it, builds it, they write tests as they build it, and then eventually this all kind of comes back up to the same thing. So if you imagine your major project, at the end of your major project, you might have some acceptance criteria based on the original requirements that say something like that, I should be able to register and log in with the same credentials, and I should be able to create a channel and invite my friends. They might be some examples of user acceptance criteria, depending on what your requirements are. Now, another way a more specific way to write acceptance criteria could be using scenario or behavior-oriented, what would you say? Like acceptance criteria, which is, instead of just kind of having this free form, descriptions of what things should do, you actually give it a bit more of a structure, which is by the given, when, then structure, which is like, given some context, when something happens, then there's a result you expect. So for example here, if I said, as a user, I want to be able to recover the password to my account so that I'll be able to access my account in case I forgot the password, the user acceptance criteria might be like, well, when someone's forgotten their password, given that the user's navigated to the login page, when the user selected forgot password and they entered a valid email, then the system sent a link to the entered email. And given that the user received the link in the email, when the user navigated through the link, then the system enables the user to set a new password. So this is sometimes a nice way to structure things in a very digestible way, as opposed to that open free form. So if you're ever kind of struggling with the structure of user stories, then this is a great way to start, because you're able to actually go and plot it out pretty easily like that. Rule-based, which is the normal type acceptance criteria, is simpler in a sense, because they're a little bit more open. Scenario-based is a bit more rigid, but again, sometimes that can be really useful if you're feeling stuck. But that constraining element can be quite hard, as in, because it has such a rigid structure, sometimes you might not be able to express what you want in that structure. Okay, so the last The second half of this lecture is about use cases. So we've just kind of finished talking about user stories, which are ways of expressing requirements. Use cases are another way of expressing requirements. You could argue that sometimes they're a way of also doing design work, but let's just think about requirements today. And sorry. Use cases represent a dialogue between the user and the system with the aim of helping the user achieve a business goal. So essentially all it does is it just demonstrates an interaction between someone. The user initiates an action and a system responds with the reaction. And they're really just high-level flows of how people interact with things. And we can either write them as a list of steps, like a recipe, or we can do them as a diagrammatic example. So I actually might start with the diagrammatic example because I think it's a bit easier, which is like, this is an example of a use case diagram where we're trying to explain how a user might interact with an ATM, and you can see that, you know, the user comes up, step A to the ATM, they enter their PIN, step B, you know, the ATM talks to the bank server responds, the ATM says, how can I help? The user says, I want to withdraw money, you know, then the ATM gives the money, you know what I mean? It's basically telling a story, but more specifically than telling a story, it's describing the behavior between users and the system for a particular use case. That's why we call them use case diagrams, because back to when we were talking about modeling last week, this is an example of behavior, you know, not static state, really just behavior. So they're quite interesting. Now, you don't have to draw them as diagrams. You can also just write them out as written descriptions. So you could actually give the use case a name. You could write down its goal. You could write down a few other pieces of information about it, about, you know, who's in the use case, a user looking to withdraw money from an ATM. And then you could just like write out the steps as well. I don't have the steps here as an example, but you could just write out the steps, you know, user comes up to this happens, this happens. So whether it is visual or whether it is textual, that's all the same and it's all pretty easy. Oh, here it is. Sorry. I thought I did include it. So it's like, if we look at like a use case list, for example, here, this is how we might write out something similar to this. So instead of a diagram, because you might feel like you have to draw stuff, you can write out something like this, or you don't even need a diagram potentially. I don't think I included it. You could actually just do, like when I say you don't need a diagram, my point is you could have a diagram but not need to draw anything. You could actually just draw a little circle for the person and a circle for the ATM and be like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, like that. There's a lot of different ways that you can kind of play around with this if you'd like to. We talked about the monorail yesterday and building out requirements for that, so we won't really need to worry about that. But what I will just very quickly throw back to is that yesterday I showed you a little piece of work that I was doing at my job, where I showed you some kind of requirements. And if you actually have a look here, you can see that whilst these don't follow some strict user story structure, they do follow like a vague user story structure where it's like you're essentially saying, this is the goal, I want to achieve this goal, and this is the reason why I want to achieve that goal. So, you know, the thing I find interesting about engineering requirements is that I don't like getting very dogmatic about it, as in strict, because every situation, every organization, every objective is different. So, you know, you do what's necessary for you, but the fundamental principles still remain the same, which is you are trying to articulate the rules that govern the work you're about to do. And that's really important. Now, we already did talk about the monorail. There's a whole bunch of further reading on this topic because it is a very theoretical topic. So feel free to read that if you'd like, though other than that, please leave some feedback for this short lecture on user stories and use cases. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat so I can answer them now. Hello Clayton says, there isn't a preference on how we write our use cases, right? Yeah, basically, like, as long as it describes behavior, and as long as it's either written or visual, sounds great. You know, that's what matters today. And yeah, like if you want, just choose one of the methods. That's what I mean. Like I know that there could be a lot of approaches people take where they're like, you should specifically do this, but I just don't like that because I think it, I don't know. It glosses over the fact that in reality nothing really follows perfect guidelines, you know, which is kind of relevant. So Anyway, let's wrap it up there. Thank you again for that particular lecture.